Hey, this is David D. Hilster. I am a critical thinker, dissident scientist, and I'm here to tell you the truth about science, something your physics teachers won't tell you, of course, unless they're Andreas C's. He's an exception. It's something the mass media won't tell you, and certainly those science evangelists won't tell you. And of course, now we're just making this into a routine, and I'm afraid, I know this someday this will be taken away from me because Greg will get the hang of this, and he will start his own channel and talk about all the amazing dissident scientists on pass me up and at least once in a while throw me a bone and say, hey, Dave got me started. But no, we're happy to have you again, Greg. Thanks for coming again, along again.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, and you picked a topic tonight which I think is just super stellar because our people now are hearing, I'm giving a voice to a lot of us who are out there who are basically, hey, we're critical thinkers. We just don't take this stuff for granted. We can criticize mainstream. We do have good ideas, in fact, and we have lots of people around it. But one of the things people don't know is there are lots of groups out there. And of course, with the age of the internet, things have gotten a lot better. So today, the topic's going to be the dissident groups, those groups outside of mainstream who've been around, some of them for quite a while, do really great work. And each one of them sort of serves their own purpose. And I am talking to the world's expert on all of these. And I know he just laughs at that, but it's true. I think it's scary because, we should have more people expert in this, but that's our goal here, right? Is to do these channels, to do all this stuff and get this out. So
Absolutely.
we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and maybe even some more, but basically 6 groups we're going to talk about today, which is going to be the MPA and CNPS, which is our group. We have the PIRT group, we have the Electric Universe group, Tesla Tech, we have the Creationist group, the Conscious group, and they all do great science, and I think that's the most important point. Each one of them will have a certain bent, but I'd like you to talk about it because, I didn't even get John Chappelle's education bio right. I mean, what kind of host am I? I
And
mean,
you
you're
ruined
like,
with
yeah.
them,
I said he went to
but I
some
let it go.
small college, and it was Harvard. So I guess
I thought you were making a joke.
no, no. I mean,
Uh,
I get them mixed up in my head because I'm 50, going to 58 here. So,
Not even sure. Yeah, I know. It's getting that way for me too.
but anyways, let's start with the MPA and CMPS. Now, you happen, I've met these people and interacted with them, but you really have the perspective of all these groups and who was in them and where they
Sure.
came from. Won't you tell us a little bit of what you know about the MPA, which then, of course, is now the CPS,
Sure.
CNPS?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say last week the attempt, and I don't know if it came across that way. We were trying to show that there's a history behind dissident science. It's not something that
Yeah.
just some quacks are now, but it's been going on for literally 100 years, at least in our little community, and in some communities even longer. And so there have always been credible people who have disagreed with the mainstream. That is nothing new. And the mainstream, and so virtually any branch of science you can think of, as well as obviously government or anything anywhere, you're going to be able to find people who disagree with the conventional opinion, and that's a good thing. That's a healthy thing. It should always be that way.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we made that point that there's been a long history of dissonance, and it just shocked me when I first learned it how much there was, how rich the history is,
And these
and how.
people came from universities too that are no
Oh yeah.
shabby, right?
Like I said, well,
MIT,
I
Harvard.
mentioned last week there were many Nobel Prize laureates who disagreed with what we might think of as modern physics today. In the 20s and the 30s and into the 40s, they had
Hmm.
disagreements on those things, and they never really did become settled science, but somehow we sort of think that they are. I don't know,
Yeah. So tell us
but
about the MPA and how that started.
right. And this week, I think we want to focus. So that was more like the I think of it as one dimension, the depth.
Right.
And this week we want to talk about the breadth.
Right.
Yeah, the history of the NPA, we touched on that also last week a little bit. It started basically in the early 90s. I want to say 91-ish. John Chappelle had a vision for getting people together to talk about science, specifically about hard physics, and that's what I think of as quantum mechanics. It's more things having to do with electrodynamics, things having to do with obviously the study of gravity and those kinds of topics, which we might think of as hard science, not so much in the realm of things like consciousness or biological science, which isn't to say those things aren't science. It's just not the science that this organization has focused on. So that was John Chappell's vision, but there were also lots of other people at that time, like Dr. Cynthia Whitney, who we also mentioned last week. She, about that same time, was along with Peter Beckman, was another name that should be.
Sure.
He's now passed away also, but Peter Beckman was one of the founders of Galilean electrodynamics, as was Thomas Barnes, and I'll mention him again a little bit later. But those were the people that started that journal, which kind of went hand in hand in many ways with the NPA, the Natural Philosophy Alliance. And Cynthia's still publishing that, I think 4 times a year, just a regular science journal. And that's pretty cool that she's been able to get people published from all around the world.
And one of the things I do want to mention about that is I did talk with her extensively because she is our chief scientist officer for our group, and I was mentioning to her, I said she's getting to the point. I said, I think she's in her mid-70s now, and she's totally lucid and everything. But I said, we got to start looking how to, for the CNPS to take that over, because once she decides, hey, I'm not going to be doing this 4 times a year, and she does it in Word and all that, we can move it to LaTeX and all that stuff. It goes to show you it is hand in hand, and I have already committed, sort of as the president of the group, to say, hey, this is something that fits right under, and it's part of the history, right?
Right. Well, it's even more than that, because the first about 10 years of the organization, people they would write a paper, or sometimes they didn't, but more often than not, they wrote a paper and then they came in and presented their paper like you would at a traditional science conference. Once in a while, there was no paper, and they just talked. So I found that out afterwards, expecting there always was. But for roughly the first 10 years, typical attendance at an event was maybe 30 people, or sometimes less. But the first few years, he had more than one a year. He had like 3 or 4. He had one in one in Oklahoma, and another one in California, and then another one in MIT, and he would go to all of them. That was the kind of madman he was, and trying to get people excited about it. And then later on, they sort of try to just have one a year where everybody would go to Phoenix or someplace. And but for the first 10 years, they just had papers, and there literally was no like a Proceedings or anything like that. So those papers exist only in those boxes that I got from John Chappell, which I would eventually I want to get them copied and scanned and put up online, so we'll have a record of those. But starting in about the 11th year, I think it was, Cynthia took over, in addition to doing her Galilean electrodynamics, which she took over full editorship after Dr. Beckman passed away. Then she also started doing the proceedings for our conferences, the NPA. So I want to say that's around 2004, 2003.
Yeah, around that time. Yeah.
Somewhere around there, yeah. And she did that, and she wasn't as aggressive maybe as we were, and so she would just, if somebody had a paper there and she would edit it a little bit, and then she'd publish it, and that was kind of. She wouldn't insist that everybody that was there have a paper, that kind of thing. She wasn't going to put too much effort into it.
Yeah.
Then about 2009, you and I got a little more active in it. So 5 years or so later, and I edited the proceedings for 3 years, which was, and I was really aggressive about it, because we were getting, as many as 120 pages.
I've got in my hand right here, because you can't see because of the way this system works, but I have in my hand volume 8 from 2011, and this sucker is huge.
Well, our limitation was that we had
the printer can only go so far.
And they allowed us 720 pages. If you got to the next page over that, then it cost more to publish it. I had to keep it under that. And I was really, really conscious of trying to get in it, because we literally had to reject a few papers just because we had that had too many pages. And this, I'm telling you, if you can ever see these, these were double columns, pretty small type. So
Oh
we're
yeah.
talking about, a phone book worth of material in this in these proceedings that we did. So I don't know. That's kind of the history in a nutshell. We had some stuff that happened a few years later, 2012, 2013. We don't have to go into that, but and you've taken over since then, David, kind of as
Hmm.
resurrecting that as what is now known as the CNPS, which is the Chappelle Natural Philosophy Society.
Yeah.
And I guess the NPA, I don't know. I guess it is no more, which is kind of
Yeah.
sad.
Well, it's not sad because it really is more still here. I mean, everybody. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion that we just renamed the group and moved on. But
Yeah.
we have some really exciting things. I mean, since we're on it, before we get into the other groups, this
Hmm.
is we're preparing a brand new website. It's criticalthinkers.info, and there we're going to be putting a very marketing type of information where we're going to literally put together flaws in mainstream and then try to get you right to those things and let you be able to read them, get it to you quickly, because today and age that's the way it is. We're going to have scientist profiles, people that are interesting, a variety. We have Cynthia Whitney, we have James Maxwell, expansion tectonics, we have the judge Duncan Shaw. I mean, here's an ex-Supreme Court justice, and he has a really interesting theory of ether. And so we're putting all these people together. And then the last one we're also putting together are models and theories. And that's one of the things we'll be talking, I'm going to be talking about on mine. And the last thing, which is brand new, which we are going to be launching for the CNPS, is our first projects. That is, the CNPS as an organization is going to gather around a topic or person, and we have three of them chosen. And yes, they do have pretty good scientists to back them up. We have Ron Hatch with GPS, because that's a big one, and it's something that grabs people's attention, and we have some really great things about that. The second one is James Maxwell, and actually all the tectonic plate theories. It's not only expansion tectonics. There's some other ones, variations on that, and of course plate tectonics itself. And he's involved with that. We're doing this on our forum. And the third one, which actually came out of my conversation just this week with Andreas Cease. For here's a guy who's teaching a completely different model from Maxwell to his students in a university, and they're loving it. Who is it?
Hmm.
Ampere and Weber.
Hmm.
And so, the reason they don't teach it, or you can't find it anywhere, because those aren't based on Lorenz, and Lorenz is linked with relativity, and if you're not linked with relativity, you're out of it. So those
Well,
in
there's a whole history of 19th century
oh
electrodynamics that
yeah,
has really been kind of thrown under the bus.
yeah,
We just ignore it, and there's so much valuable stuff that comes from that material.
right,
It's
right.
just
So
I've
yeah,
read a lot of Dr. Assis's papers myself, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of what he calls relational mechanics,
right, right,
which you
right.
mentioned a little bit. And in fact, I coined a new word a couple weeks ago. I've argued. Sorry for the aside here, but I've argued with people about the use of the word relativity, and I was like, well, let's redefine the word. And I've been saying this for years that's relativity should mean moving relative to something else, but what it really means is Einstein's theory.
Right.
And so I finally decided, you know what, I'm going to let everybody define relativity, and I'm going to give that up, and I'm going to call it
Relational. Relation.
relationivity.
Well, relational.
Relationivity means things move
Yeah.
relative to other things,
No, I think that's
in
really great.
relation to
Yeah.
other things.
So that's with the CMPS. Those are the things we are looking to really launch. So we're going to be having this website, but we as a group are going to try to author papers and studies and papers about these things, where we'll put out the facts about the GPS, and and about plate tectonics, expansion tectonics, and those things. And work with Andreas Cease to get Ampere and Weber's stuff out there. We have our Wikipedia, which of course we can write into and not worry about them throwing things out, because that's one of the problems we have. So that's an exciting thing that's going to be coming up this year, but really next year in 2018. The CNPS is actually starting to get behind and work together on certain topics. And what's really interesting about them, it doesn't mean that these things are right or wrong. It means that these things are lacking. They're not there. These things don't exist. So that's really exciting. Well, let's go on to another group, which is very similar. I think the other group is PIRT.
Well, there's actually quite a few groups, but there's one in particular that has been around for a while.
And it's related
PIRT.
to the MPA, right? It's sort of
similar.
Yes.
Similar. It's in Europe, and it's called the PIRT, which is PIRT, which is an acronym for Physical Interpretation of Relativity Theory. And again, a group of scientists who mostly live in Europe, and the leader, I guess, of that group is a guy named Peter Rollins. And I really love Peter Rollins. I brought one of his books, and I've enjoyed his books a tremendous. This one's called
Revolution
Too Far, and it's the establishment of general relativity. So in this book, he basically makes the case that that general relativity really wasn't saying all that we didn't already know. Most of everything that was in the theory was already well established anyway, and that, at least that much of it, which was true. And so it seemed like a revolution, but in fact it wasn't a revolution at all. There wasn't really a lot of new material out of that. And it's a very compelling case he makes. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Rollins' stuff.
Mm-hmm. Can you get that book?
The wave particle duality. I think it's called Wave. I can't remember. It's just something to do with waves.
Is that book available that you showed, or?
I got this from Dr. Rollins himself, and I don't even. I'll get you a link later on and find out. This particular one was written in 1994. He's written probably a dozen books. I think he's a great author myself. Very, very clear, very clean arguments. But again, this is the kind of book. There is a little bit of math. I wouldn't say it's just like overwhelming. So if some formulas make you feel giddy, then it's maybe not for you. But it's at least, it's at least 90%. It's prose and it's very understandable, I think. And as we tried to talk last week, so much of understanding science is not just understanding equations, but understanding the physical interpretation behind the equations and what they mean and things like that. That's far more important than the equations alone. So
yeah, so that's PIRT, and it's in the UK, correct?
Yeah, and the gentleman who was I had a wonderful correspondence with before. His name was Viv Pope. You remember? I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
He's passed on now, but he was such a neat guy, and we had the best discussions. I still have all those old emails that I had with him. He authored several books too on just his idea of what he understood light to be, and we had some differences and we had some agreements. And he also was was one of the very few what I call relationalists. A relationalist is someone who believes that things move relative to other things.
Right.
It's surprising how few there are, but there are a few. Tom Phipps is one, who's now passed on, and Peter Grinnell was one. There's a few.
Yeah, so that's PIRT, and that they met during what time frame?
Well, I think they're still meeting, but they were active also in the 90s and into close to 25 some years, I believe.
It's sort of in the history of this modern dissident science. It revolves around relativity, because that's what really got John Chappell into it. So that was a sort of a rallying point in the beginning, and then it sort of grew from there.
There seemed to be, people tended to get more organized. Dissidents, I guess, were more organized by around 1990s. I don't know why. That sort of was the time when that sort of came to a head and people started to say, hey, let's get more organized. I will also say this, the NPA probably, I don't know, I would say less than half probably about a third of the people have PhDs in the NPA, something like that, and another third are probably at least half are like retired engineers. We got a lot of those people.
Right.
Whereas PIRT, I think, tends to be a little bit more academic. So I would say probably more like 70 or 80, maybe 100% of them are PhDs. They're all professors, and they're all much more academic. It's not to say that they turn their nose up. That's just the kind of group that they are. So every group has its own characteristics, sort of based on who founded it.
Well, that's one of the things we hear all the time. Oh, you guys got, their dissidents are people who are not educated, or they come from, they're surfers or something like that. But
Yeah.
but anyways, that's great. So let's go to another group which
Sure.
is really actually marketing wise is probably, I would see, the most successful group in the
I think
sense
so.
of getting out there. It's quite amazing and intriguing. They do a lot of great work, and that's the Electric Universe group.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I would guess that's at least some of the people who are listening to you may be EU people.
Oh
They
yeah,
call
absolutely.
themselves EU,
Sure.
Electric Universe. And
Sure.
basically the basic premise is they mainly focus on issues of astronomy, and
Yeah.
and they believe that the interactions between planets and the interaction between solar systems are predominantly, the force that governs most of those interactions and motions is not gravity, but electricity.
Mhm.
And so that there are electrical interactions, there's electrical forces, there's movements which are based on electricity. And when you say, okay, electricity is the governing force through all these interactions, and gravity doesn't play a major part in that, it changes the paradigm completely, because that is
Mhm.
not what conventional science teaches.
Sure.
And so, for example, the sun would be considered more like it's Professor Don Scott calls it like a PNP conductor. He's an
Mhm.
electrical engineer.
My father's electrical engineer. So.
Yes, and so
You are, yeah.
one of the questions regarding the sun is, how come it's so really hot in the Corona area, but then it's actually cooler inside, so it goes cool, hot, cool. That's kind of weird, and it's
Right.
like the middle section is sort of like in a PNP junction. The end, the middle thing is like a governing the
Right.
entire operation. And so there's more going on than just throwing in electrons. And if it was a nuclear furnace, it would just get cooler as you move out slowly. But
Mhm.
that's not what
Sure.
it is at all. It's
Sure.
much more like there's this control mechanism which takes place, which is what you see in electronics, and it acts more like that. And it makes a lot of sense. We could spend hours just talking about the electric universe theory, but that's one example.
Yeah, they
Another,
have.
of
Yeah.
course, one of the heroes of electric universe theory is Halton Arp, who
Right.
we awarded our Sagnac
Yes.
Award to back in 2012, I think it was.
Yeah.
And he's also passed on. But
Yeah.
in many ways, he's the Galileo of his day. He was an astronomer back in as a Palomar Labs near San Diego for in the 60s, and because he was trying to come up with some alternative theories, they kicked him out of there, and he ended up going to Germany, and he spent decades in Germany as a scientist, where he did pass away about 4 years ago, I
Yeah.
guess.
Not too long. Yeah.
And one of the things that he was able to do was show that redshift is not just a function of distance. In other words, there are planets, and there are systems that are interacting with each other, which are gravitationally linked. They're close
Mhm.
to each other, and yet
Quasars.
they
Yes.
have significantly different redshifts.
Yes.
And he was showing that the one with the larger redshift was typically ejected from the larger body. And so
Right.
a couple of lessons. Number one is that redshift is not just a function of distance, which is assumed in the gravitational models.
Right.
And secondly, that this ejection phenomena does affect how much, I think of redshift as kind of how much randomness there is. When something's brand new and it just gets ejected, it's going to have a lot more energy, a lot
Sure.
more
Sure. Sure.
entropy, that
Sure.
kind of thing. Anyway, so that's just one example, but that once you throw that out there and say, well, that's not true, then what about the Big Bang? What does that say about that? It says a lot, and we won't go into it. But the electric universe has an enormous following, and they'll put out a video and they'll get 100,000 views,
Oh, sure.
no problem. And David, of course, that we used to meet with one of their
Yeah,
leaders, was Dave Talbot, and
sure,
who has also authored a book with Wal Thornhill. We know Wal real well,
sure.
and they came to several of our conferences. They came to our conference before they started doing all this wonderful stuff on their own,
Yeah.
and so anyway, they're a terrific group. I
Yeah,
think
there's a
very
couple
highly.
of,
They also have a really large following, and that's
yeah.
one thing we don't have.
Well, I think we're going to be growing. It's a different thing. I think another few things that we can talk about it. I'm going to do a video on it myself, but like we can mention, they do talk about, for instance, electrical scarring of planets. That's one of the
Sure.
things they do talk about. They see links in control, like you said, not as much that there is electrical forces to that. One of the predictions I thought that was very interesting they made, and I think it was Wal Thornhill, but some of those people in the EU, was the comets, right? People were calling comets, these dirty ice balls,
Stone
and they
walls.
said
That's
when,
conventional
and
thinking.
they predicted when they sent that probe right into a comet, there'd be a flash, and that's more like an electrical thing. And sure enough, that's what happened. And so
You're
they're
talking about the Shoemaker-Levy
right.
comet crashing into Jupiter. This
No,
is
no,
the
that's
big
one.
event
Yeah, that was one.
back
But
in
there was
94-ish, and
right, but there
Wal
was another
Thornhill
one though.
predicted there would be an electrical exchange before
Right,
the actual impact, and sure
right.
enough, like you
Yeah,
said,
but the other one, there was one where they actually go into an asteroid. So there was that one, I believe, as well.
yeah,
So
they've made a bunch of
or
accurate
a
predictions.
comet, or yeah. And so there are a lot of different types of models that they look at, and they also one of the things I do want to say too is these groups are our group is non-political, non-religious, non-sort of historical. It's
Mhm.
more just a science. So that's why we allow everybody from all walks of life, all beliefs, all creeds, all religions, all countries. And one of the things the EU talks a lot about is ancient history,
Yeah, they're
and
really into that.
I think that's a lot of where their big following comes in too, because those people really enjoy petroglyphs, ancient history, trying to decipher things where there's no writing, and again, if it may not be your boat, but it is to a lot of people. But what we're trying to always say, and especially in the CNPS, we look at the science, and there's a lot of good science in there. So the EU people are to be congratulated. And of course, they came to us, saw what we were doing, and did it better than we did with the
In many ways,
organization.
they already had a big following even before
Yeah,
we
they
met with
did.
them, but
Yeah, yeah.
they weren't meeting in regular conferences. They didn't have
Oh,
a
yeah.
YouTube
No, no.
channel back in 2010, and they've done a lot since we
Yeah,
talked.
it's really great.
But
Well,
I will point out, that the organization tends to look like the vision, obviously, of the founders. So in their case, Dave Talbot, he wrote books back in the 70s on his ideas about, the beliefs of ancient writings. And
right.
he would look at ancient texts, which included the Bible, but also
Sure.
would look at other texts and say,
Hmm.
seems to be what they're trying to say, that there was
Right.
actually stuff going on in our solar system,
Hmm.
that that suggests that it has only been thousands of years that since our solar system was formed.
Sure, sure.
And you're welcome, of course, anyone's welcome to disagree with that, but what's weird about it, and this is, I'll not just say this, I'm a Christian and I know you're
Hmm.
not,
Sure, sure, sure.
and that's okay. But most, very few creationists are not Christians, and
Hmm.
yet there's a lot of people, and I would say young Earth people. Sometimes even as I don't make a big deal out of it, but a lot of times people in the NPA are surprised when they find out that I'm a young Earth creationist. But there's a lot of young Earth people in the electric universe, and their argument is that, but they're not Christians. That's my point.
Oh,
And
sure, sure, sure.
and
And I
that's
think,
kind of
yeah,
weird. I know. So you're not going to find that in very many places, but
yeah, and I
you
think
find plenty of
the
Christians
right.
who are not young Earth people, but you're not going to find a lot of non-Christians who are young Earth people. But their argument is that because electric universes cause so much catastrophism, in other words, things
Yeah,
change
sure.
instantly and very suddenly and very dramatically in a very short period of time. Because that's the case, we can't say what things were like a few thousand years ago or whatever. and so
Right.
that's their attitude. They're kind of agnostic about the age of the universe because they don't know. But a
Sure.
lot of that is stemming from the beliefs of people like David Talbot, and that's why they focus on those things as
Sure.
well as the science. So they're, um,
Right.
it's an
And yeah.
interesting mix.
Yeah.
And I say one more thing about them.
Sure.
A lot of
Sure.
Dave's ideas stem from a guy named Immanuel Velikovsky.
Sure. Of course.
So if you're a believer in Velikovsky's ideas, then you're gonna be attracted to the EU, right?
Exactly, exactly. And I think again the most important thing is to understand everybody comes from some type of bent. Everybody has some for me, for instance, I am much more the particle infinity. That to me is more my DNA, where somebody like you maybe into the ancient history and those ideas. And like you said, you've got people looking at things that happen much more catastrophes that could have happened not too long ago. And again, I think the most important thing for us to always remember: we look at the science. We don't care where it's coming from. So when we get up there, yes, we don't listen to people talk about in our group, the CNPS. We don't listen to people talk about the age and their particular bent on whether it's Earth is young or whether it's old. What we are looking at is always science. But if you are a person who has more attached to what you like and what you like science, these groups give you those opportunities. So,
Exactly.
and like I said, the good thing is the CNPS is a place where I think it's really a gathering place that says, okay, science, we don't care what it is, come in as long as it's solid in its ideas. Let's go
Evidence
on.
based. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Let's go on to the next one, another group which is really fascinating, and I think it's the way I look at it, they seem to be the tinkerers
Yeah.
of
The talented tinkerer is the way I
yeah.
like to think of
And,
it.
and and why don't you tell us about Tesla Tech?
Sure. Tesla Tech is actually only one of many, really, groups that that focus on science having to do with obviously Nikola Tesla. So,
Mhm.
if you know anything about Nikola Tesla's history, there's a whole lot of there's a lot of stuff, because
Sure.
obviously he was the guy, first of all, to discover radio. He expanded those ideas. He was able to transmit signals before Marconi. Pretty much universal belief, especially obviously of Tesla followers, that Marconi basically stole Tesla's ideas. He did remote control things. We think remote control, robotics or whatever. He was
Sure.
doing this back, around 1900. It's
Sure.
just,
Sure.
even before. And he, of course, most famously came up with the AC power system, which is the basis for our grid today, the three-phase system. That was Nikola Tesla's idea.
Right.
And he was able to demonstrate this early in the 1890s. There's a famous battle between Tesla and Edison.
Right. Right.
Tesla came out the winner on that one. Edison was trying to do DC power. But anyway, what is maybe less well known, that's all kind of conventional stuff, because Tesla, within a few years of having come up with this great new power system, said, wait a minute, I got something that's even better. We can transmit power without wires. We can do it
Sure.
literally for free. In other words, people can have access to it anywhere. And there,
Sure.
as the story goes, JP Morgan, who was financing him at the time, uh, basically cut off the funding once he realized that this new system was going to impact his
Right.
wallet.
Sure.
And
Sure.
um,
Sure.
and so there it was. Did Tesla really know what he was talking about, or was it just a bunch of hooey? And he supposedly had this stuff called the death ray, which was all these technologies, which to this day are still not well understood. And so that's where we those who spend a fair amount of time, in conspiracy theories and saying, well, the government has all of these technologies and we should have them too. And they developed all this stuff. Well, it all goes back to Tesla, because
Sure.
supposedly his stuff was stolen when he died in 1943. Lots of stuff like that. So you'll find those kinds of people, but you'll also find people, in the Tesla world who are just trying to reproduce what it was that he was doing. And
Sure.
they've been doing this now for decades and decades. And one of the groups that's probably been the most persistent group is the Tesla Tech group.
Hmm.
But there's also there is apparently one of the things that Tesla himself did was a place called Wardenclyffe, which was on Long Island, and there was a GoFundMe about 5 years ago. I gave him some money.
Oh
They
yeah, I
raised
saw.
well over $1 million, and they were able to actually reproduce and put a museum, Tesla museum, on Wardenclyffe. So that's another group. There's been a bunch of Tesla groups over the year, but the most, I guess, persistent group has been the Tesla Tech group, and that's been really through the persistence of Steve Elswick.
Sure.
He's come to our conferences. I've spoken at his conference a few times, as well as the EU conferences.
Yeah.
And so for the most part, most of the people get up there and they say, they'll present, this is what I've been working on, and here's where I think the energy is, and here's what I can do, and there'll be guys up there actually showing their little machine and what it can do.
Yeah.
And that's kind of cool. So
It
there's
is.
there's a lot of water technologies. There's definitely some interesting properties having to do with water. There's obviously, again, the remote transmission of power, which Tesla was trying to do, and there's all those kinds of things related to that. So people are in this group. They're not all necessarily PhDs. In fact, very few of them are, but they're people that are just trying to figure out what it was that Tesla was doing, trying to reproduce it, trying to explain it in their own way, but they're hands-on people. That's why I like to think of them as talented tinkerers.
Yeah, they're experimentalists, really. I mean,
Absolutely.
they're putting this stuff together, and I know several times I think we did it twice when we were in with Flagstaff. Well, no, not Flagstaff. No,
Was it
Albuquerque.
Albuquerque? Yeah,
We
that's
were in
right.
Albuquerque, and because they meet there almost
They meet there
annually,
every year.
right? And so we decided to hook up with them. And I remember one time I sort of sat in and we did a sort of a how do you say, one of those meetings where both of our groups came together, and
Right.
we talked about something. I don't know if it was gravity or something, and it was really interesting because I'm sort of, I was there on a positive note, and I knew one of the conflicts we were going to have is the tinkerers and the experimentalists in their garage often use terminology and philosophy and
Yeah.
words in a really loose way, which can get them in trouble. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that, it has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just
Just
that
imprecise
right,
use of
yeah.
language. Yeah.
And so what happened was, I think my father was doing it was on gravity, and so he was talking, and he's of course our model's completely physical, absolutely Newtonian. So there's no things that are mysterious and fields and those kinds of things. And so when the person from one of the guys from Tesla Tech started talking, and there was half of us from the CNPS, or in this case the MPA, and half from Tesla Tech, he started to talk, and right away I knew there was going to be a conflict between the two. And so I immediately started talking. I said, look, and I explained to him, I said, one of the things is you guys do a lot of work and do things that we don't do. We've spent a lot of time on theory and the way we
Mhm.
talk about it, making sure we use the right words, the models that we use, the terminology, the assumptions. And so we started talking. I said, when you say this, you're saying energy, and that's a thing. It really isn't a thing. It's a concept that's very useful, and we talked about.
Right.
And so what we did is I sort of disarmed both sides, and we sort of came down. And I think that's one of the things that still could happen.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things it shows you that each of the groups have been working on their own, have the bent, but I think in the end the CMPS always ends up being sort of the group that tries, okay, what does all this stuff mean, and what's the science going beyond it? So it's sort of like the I don't know, gathering place, the place where things get more formalized,
Mhm.
because no one's doing that. We don't have that happening in the universities. So, but the Tesla Tech people are just, I mean, let's face it. You go to the museum. I went to LA and been there for a while. Never went into to Mount Wilson, and they have the observatory up there. And what do they have as a big display, which everybody has to see once a day? A big Tesla Powerball with the
Sure.
lightning. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't care who you
It's
are.
impressive.
It's
Yeah, I've actually
impressive,
been inside a big old Faraday cage, and I've
right?
had a
Yep,
million volts being shot at me.
yep.
And it's like this lightning is coming right at you, and you can see it. You can see the fingers and the fingers of fingers. It's pretty cool. So yeah, that's obviously, when people think of a mad scientist, that's the first thing they think of is, this ball with
Right.
electricity flow going out all over
They
the
always have
place.
one on set somewhere, and it's going away at it. But that's great. Now let's talk. We're going to depart a little bit, and we're going to get to an area where, of course, it's easy for people who are in science, who are just science people. They don't, maybe they're not religious, especially. Let's face it. There's probably more scientists that are not as religious than other groups, and that's true. My father is a Christian, a practicing Christian for many years. We have other people in our group that are Buddhists. We have people who are Hindu. We have people who are all Muslim. But one of the groups that's very active and has been doing really amazing work is the creationist groups. And we're talking about the science behind them. And I think you even have a book about that. Why don't you talk about that? Because I know you're part of that group,
Sure.
and tell us a little bit.
Well, I've been to a couple of creation science conferences, and again, for those that are not Christians, you don't have to agree with everything that comes out of these conferences, but you do have to understand that these are scientific conferences, and
Yeah.
I just happen to have I purchased the proceedings from all these various conferences, and the first one that they had, this particular group, and by the way, there's more than one group, but this particular group is probably the largest. They have a conference once every 4 years, roughly, and this is called the Proceedings of the First International Conference on Creationism,
Hmm.
which was published. Can you read that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Published in
Perfectly good.
1986, and they put all their proceedings. So it's very similar to our proceedings, where everybody has papers, and
Sure,
and
sure.
they'll write, have an abstract and an introduction, and they attempt to have uh, people reviewing each of the papers, just like we're doing, and they have kind of a whole system. Pretty much everybody who writes for these conferences is a doctorate.
Right.
Almost everybody, not everybody, but I would say, I'm just looking at the contents here, it's probably 80%. So again, it's very, very academic.
Right.
And one of the authors at this particular conference back in 1986 was our own Dr. Bill Lucas.
Right.
And the
Right.
paper he wrote in this particular one was a call for reformation in modern science.
Yes.
So some of the things, obviously, this not always the same kinds of things. So some of the issues here was the Great Delusion, the age of the Earth was one, the origin
Hmm.
of life, a
Sure.
lot of geology kinds of things, obviously stretching out time. So there's one on just answering questions about evolution. Um, the problem of time, well, that's a little more kind of up our alley.
Right.
So there's, and then it goes on to things like Mount St. Helens and catastrophisms. As you recall, in 1986, Mount St. Helens was relatively new. That happened in 1980. So there was a big study on that. Without knowing what the paper was about, I know it probably was talking about the fact that, there was a lot of rocks that came out of the Mount St. Helens episode, which could be aged at millions of years,
Hmm.
making the case that it looked an awful lot like the Grand Canyon. So that would just be an example of
Sure.
the kind of thing you might see. And Dr. Lucas's paper could just as easily have been put into our NPA proceedings,
Sure.
because he was just talking about some of the problems in modern science. And I will say this much, is a real interesting, just kind of a weird place to be, because I look at myself as kind of it's like I'm a dissident in a dissident's world, because as a creationist, most of them, and I mentioned earlier, you may recall, I talked about Thomas Barnes
Yeah.
was one of the guys that was the founder of Galilean electrodynamics, and
Yeah.
so in a way was one of the founders with Peter Beckman of the NPA itself.
Right. Right.
Anyway, Dr. Barnes was also one of the founders of the creation science community, back when there was a book written in 1960 by Dr. Henry Morris, which was called The
Hmm.
Genesis Flood, which was kind of considered to be the father of modern creation science.
Hmm.
And that book in particular was kind of the opening door. Anyway, they founded this organization back in 1964. Dr. Barnes was among them. He was a critic of Einstein, and so in the earliest days, there was certain openness, obviously, to criticism of Einstein. But since then, it's like the creationists, it's like they've got enough fires to try to put out with
Right.
with the
Right.
problems that they're dealing with.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
many of those that followed Dr. Barnes became kind of pro Einstein, and they're like kind of taking a conventional view towards that sort of, anybody who's critical of Einstein, it must be an idiot kind of a thing. And so unfortunately that's affected people like Dr. Lucas and myself. I actually put an abstract a couple of times to them and had it approved. And then 8 months later, somebody else read it and said, no, we can't take that. And so it's like, well, that was weird. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that what I guess I'm trying to say is different dissident groups, and this is the point I tried to make last week, is that one group might think that another group is we're okay in our dissidents, but this group over here, they're the
Right,
wackos.
right, right,
it's
right.
it's really too bad because
Yeah,
there's value in all the groups. You don't necessarily have to obviously agree with everybody's opinions, but for example, the creationist group and the EU group, if you're a believer in the electric universe and you think that paradigm makes some sense, you're not going to be very welcome in the creation science group. And
right.
so there's only a handful of people, Dr. Lucas, myself, and maybe Dr. Barry Setterfield is another one,
Yeah,
and a few other people who are EU supporters. We believe in that paradigm generally, although there may be specific things we don't believe in, but we're also creationists, and we're not always welcome in this community, which is sad. But that's just that's kind of how it is with all these various groups. They don't all necessarily see eye to eye or welcome each other. So,
well, one of the things is too, I think I think you can maybe talk a little bit about is, for instance, Dr. Lucas's work. If you look at Dr. Lucas's work on his force equations, he really has done something that all of physics has been trying to do, and which is to unify the forces in the traditional force equations. He was being groomed as one of the great physicists of his generation, and he was ousted not because of his idea or his beliefs in creationism. He was ousted because he criticized Einstein.
that's right.
And if you look at his work and when he presents to our group, there are probably many people who have no idea that he's even part of the creationist group. And it's not because it's just like with anything. When you go to a group, if I go to the EU group and you have to understand what their bents are, what their focus is, what they like, and you present in that way. You don't want to, it's not going to do you any good to go there and preach something that
Just
says
ruffle
this.
feathers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think one of the things is that one of the scientists we highlight in the CMPS and the MPA and CMPS is Dr. Lucas because of his work. If you're one of those people who love the force equations, all the traditional equations that you find in physics, he came from a very traditional background, but he actually, because he was kicked out, actually I think did better work. And like you said, we have people who believe Einstein to be correct, people who don't. I know people who are in the EU group, and I talk with them personally, and they said, I don't buy everything that's going on in the EU group. I don't buy probably
Yeah. Well, and they should.
80% of what's in the CNPS. Not because they're wrong, it's because each one of us are looking at areas, and because we're in a paradigm shift, who's right? I mean,
Right. Well, and it's
is
easy to
ether?
get into a bubble, I guess, is my
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
You get kind of, into your own little group, and you don't realize that there's other perspectives on just about anything you can think of. And the world is really much larger than we thought. That's why when you say I have a big library, well, I have a library in certain areas, the areas we're talking about, but there's a lot of areas I don't know much about at all. So,
Sure, sure. And the last one we want to talk about would be the sort of area of consciousness.
mhm.
One of the people, for those, of course, who are my subscribers, you really were in luck to see and talk. I did an interview with George Coyne, who actually I just met in Vancouver this year at the CNPS 2017 conference. He came up to me and he says, "Hey, I want to give a paper." I said, "What?" And he said, "Consciousness." And of course, my red flags go up because sometimes that isn't very scientific. It becomes a
Sometimes
lot,
not.
and sometimes not. And they'll talk about, so they've got their vocabulary and it's all sort of new age, but it's vacuous. This
Mhm.
guy was very, very almost computer science like, and I'm a
Mm,
computer scientist, so
mhm.
I was listening to him, I go, this is really good. Do you want
Mhm.
to speak? And he spoke. He has his book out, and who perhaps will be reading it is Noam Chomsky,
Mm,
and he is no small person in the world.
exactly.
I'm a linguist. I've got my master's in linguistics. He is one of the the greatest linguist of all time, because he came up with how syntax in the modern linguistics is due to him. And of course, he's also been very political in the last few years and philosophical. A lot of the income inequality that people are talking about. But so George Coyne is somebody who deals with consciousness. He gave a talk on it, and it was, very quite interesting. And you also
Mhm.
have some people in that area as well,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Well, one of a big name I think in this area is Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if you're familiar. I should have got his book out, but he has what's the name of his book? Was the ten assumptions of science, and that of course gets my interest because I'm always looking at assumptions. But one of those assumptions is that basically, how should I say, it's the what's the word when that physics does not deal with conscious things. It deals with only with unconscious things. I mean, you have A moves and that causes B to move, and there's a force between them. Where does consciousness even enter into that equation? So to assume that things are unconscious is sort of, well, it's an assumption.
Well, just make sure for my subscribers, I did do the 10 assumptions of science, but those were from Borkert.
Yeah, no, this is a different group.
That's a
Rupert
different one. I'm just
Sheldrake has a
right.
book, and I'm sorry for not remembering
That's
the name of the
okay.
book.
That's okay. I'm just
But it's
making sure
something like
people
the
don't
10
know. Yeah.
assumptions of science, and
Right.
he mainly, his focus, and listen, I don't agree with everything that he has to say, but he definitely will make you think. I promise
Right.
that.
Right.
And so he talks about, how do we know? How do we know? And I'm not saying that it is, but how do we know, for example, that the sun isn't conscious? It's like, well, we don't really
Yeah.
know that. How
Yeah.
do we know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How do we decide what, things are? Some things are conscious and some things are not. And what does it mean to be conscious? And it's like, wow, this is, beyond me. But I guess my simple argument is, if I raise my arm, I'm not violating the laws of physics, and yet uh, there was a choice involved in here. So something physical happened as a result of my will. Obviously, my consciousness has some impact on physics. It wasn't just the laws of physics alone that determined, that this action. So to ignore that is to miss something, obviously. And when we get into this is where a lot of people who are studying quantum, conventional quantum mechanics,
Conventional. Yes.
they're looking at the Heisenberg uncertainty, and they're able, they try to somehow take this uncertainty and say, oh, because there's uncertainty, then basically impossible things can happen, and I don't agree with that, but that's where they're coming from, and they're trying to come up with the argument that somehow that consciousness can be mechanized. There's, the universe is completely mechanical.
Mhm.
And Rupert Sheldrake disagrees with that, and I do too. But there's many others. There's Jack Serfati is another name that maybe some people are well known, who studies quantum physics and its relation to consciousness. So again, a lot of there's a number of different groups that kind of focus on this, and this is one of the areas where I was hoping as NPA or CNPS members, we might reach out to groups like that. Um,
Sure. Sure.
we're a little bit more interested in just the mechanics alone is enough to keep me occupied. But
But it's part
there's
of
obviously
what.
more to the universe than just that.
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons. In fact, I have some of the subscribers say I don't like the word philosophy and
Mm,
natural philosophy. But the truth of the matter is, the more you really try to be a critical thinker of the universe and you try to come up with some type of model, you try to come up with and look at the problems, the immense problems really of modern physics. Modern physics we're in a paradigm shift time. I mean,
mm,
we're not talking about like, oh, tweaks to things. I mean, we're under fire is the Big Bang. Under fire are plate tectonics as we know it. Under fire are cosmological models. Under fire is even relativity, where we have a physics teacher in Brazil teaching things that are not related to relativity, all these things. So we're in a time where we really need to look at things. And when you do that, and it takes you some time, if you're a person that's just starting to get into this because of this channel and other websites, and you're starting to look at these things, you're going to find yourself real quick in the area of philosophy. I mean, you
mhm.
really are. It's going to be
Can't
something
help it. Yeah.
you can't help it. So this idea, and so I think that's something that we really need to do more in the CNPS. And of course, there's whole other areas we haven't even talked about. And I think and these are for other topics, but we have, the whole water side. That's a
Oh,
whole thing.
absolutely. Yeah,
We
water
have,
science, and that
we,
kind of fits in with the Tesla Tech stuff in a way
sure,
because they
sure.
deal with, what are the special properties of water. But like, for example, Dr. Gerald Pollack, I
Yep.
mean, he has a whole conference just
Yeah,
talking.
we're not even going to talk about that because we'll just go on for another couple hours. There's
Yeah,
also math. I heard we had
people that just came here.
Peter Erickson talk, and Bruce Nappy, who's a brilliant man from MIT. He's one of the people super important and super intelligent guys that we have in the CMPS right now, just helping us out. He's not a mathematics guy, and he was freaking out, and he thought this guy was making this stuff up, and I'm a mathematician, and I was being blown away because he's not the world's best presenter. He isn't. He's not going to win awards, but
A
he
lot of
wrote,
NPA people aren't.
yeah, but those are because we have that. We have the other area, and I'm only going to mention it. No, you're not going to talk about it. Is
Another big
geometry?
one on
No,
my book is
geometries
cold
and
fusion. Yeah.
structure. Geometry and structure.
Yeah, sure. We have a structures group. Yeah, people just, and that's basically, maybe I put a little context to that. I think I mentioned last week that I got my start and interest was in the structure of the atom, basically, models of the atom which are moving. There's parts within each atom that's moving, and there's circulation going on. And it was the common sense science, which Dr. Lucas and
Hmm.
David Bergman got me involved in, and
Sure.
this was a huge interest to me. So yeah, and that just led to other kinds of structures. Well, what are the ways, for example, a circular thing can go around? Well, it can work this kind of a knot. It can move in a torus. It can have double toruses and all these kinds of different things. And then the more you start digging into that, the more you think, well, now maybe these structures themselves has something to do with the atomic properties that we see. Maybe it's and then there's people that have put together models, physical models, that for each of the various things in the atomic, you know, t- table,
Sure.
that periodic table that makes some sense, that are showing all these various properties in terms of physical structural models. So structure is a big part of understanding how
Yeah, and that's another topic,
things
man.
are the
That
way they are.
that we can probably just do a whole thing on ourselves
Sure.
on
And I
just
mentioned cold
that.
fusion is another one,
Yep.
and that's
Yep.
just, the science back in 1989. There was this big to do in cold
Sure.
fusion, and it was hot for about 6 months, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of people at MIT decided, no, we're gonna squash it,
Right.
and it went underground. But since then, there have been, obviously not the U.S. government, but other governments like Japan and India, other places have funded, and non-government agencies and have funded these things.
The U.S.
So
government has. There was in 2009. There was 60 Minutes. Did cold fusion
yeah,
is hot again.
Israel's a place where a lot of cold fusion studies.
DARPA's. So yeah.
Yeah, they're doing a little bit. They're not advertising it, but I
Yeah.
guess they're doing a little bit of research on there too. But it's been reproduced. These ideas have been, which basically, you know, the, these things have been reproduced, number one, and the way they generally work is you'll have set up an electrolysis experiment. So you got an anode and a cathode, and you have them made out of certain materials. They have to be made out of just the right materials. The
Sure.
water itself has to be heavy water. All these conditions have to be just right, and then even then it can take a couple weeks. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, bam! This reaction happens. That's the way it generally works, and it's like nobody really knows why it all of a sudden
But we're going
started.
to use that. We're going to stop. I'm going to stop you there because we're just going to go on for another hour. So.
Well, I just want to point out that's another
Sure,
error.
sure, sure, absolutely. So today we talked about the MPA and the CNPS and its relationship to PIRT. Sort of started with the relativity, then really expanded out to the natural philosophy, the EU group, which is doing a whole different idea where instead of gravity, electrical forces are much more at work in the universe. And we have Tesla Tech, which are really those tinkerers. I'm sure there are people in the audience fit in a lot. I'm sure we're going to have people, and already do have people who are creationists, but are also interested in science. This idea I did a thing on one of my videos. This idea that if you are a creationist, or you think, well, we are changing the world, but maybe it's not global warming, it's something else, you get immediately labeled as a person who doesn't like science and who doesn't know science, and that's baloney,
Hmm.
because some of the best science I've ever seen have come from creationists. I'm not talking about the creation part of it. I'm talking about the science part of it. So it doesn't, I think that's, and then we also talk about consciousness, and it's something like, how would that fit in? But it's
Hmm.
philosophy, really. So,
Hmm.
man, I mean, this has been great.
Well, if you study the inners of an atom, you're going to have to get there eventually.
Yeah,
You
you, uh,
just can't
you,
help it.
yeah. I mean, and it's like, well, okay, two atoms collide. How does your hand stay above the table? Well, but then when you look at it, there's so much space there. You end up not finding anything that collides with anything. I mean, you get to those kinds of ideas, but at least you have to address them. You have to be able to discuss them. You have to be able to go to some place and talk to another guy at the conference, and they're not going to look at you like you're nuts, because these things are real questions. But listen, thank you so much, Greg, once
Absolutely.
again. Like I said, I'm hoping this keeps getting you warmed up for a channel, because I think you would just do great. But for now, I'll take all the credit and all the subscribers. So I'm
Sounds good.
kidding. I mean, I only the more subscribers just to get more people involved. That's the way I look at it.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
but
Well, to those who are listening, I mean, I hope you do find time to look into each of these various things. I mean, we have resources. You can look at the
yep,
World Science Database. Some people from each of these various groups are
yep,
already represented in our database. You can find out about these things. If
yep.
you want to know specifically about some of these groups, we've got it, but I guess I can probably put
Right.
together something you can check a link into. But uh, all of this is possible, but it's not, it's not going to just come to your door. You got to go looking
Right,
for
you
it.
got to go for it. So what you'll do is, I'll have Greg, you send me again, right after we close this down, because these go up pretty
Okay.
quick. Send me a link to at least the books that you mentioned, and anything else. I'll put some of the links to the groups, because I do have those myself. But
Okay.
throw that together, send me an email, and thank you
Absolutely.
so much again.
All right. You bet. You have a good one. We'll see you next week.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. And remember, as I always say, don't take my word. Especially don't take Greg's word.
Don't,
He's on this
no.
side. Read it yourself. That's why we're here. We're talking about it. Read it for yourself. You may have a different bent or a different direction yourself. You may, and hopefully, sometime add to the flow of science. But just stay critical, stay thinking. I'm your science therapist. I'm here to get these people who read and see all this stuff in mass media and say, this is kind of crazy. Is there somebody out there with a voice? Well, I'm not the only voice. Greg is one, and many others. So thanks so much again, Greg. Good night.
You bet. Bye.